Kia ora koutou. I'm joining you from sunny Dunedin today, and I'm really thrilled to be here. So my name is Claire Lacey, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Otago. So when I introduced this project, Concussion Episodes Representing Brain Injury Through Poetry, the reactions I get are mostly confused. Poetry and brain injury, well, how do those things go together? The answer begins with the picture you see in front of you. That's me in 2013. I was a roller derby athlete based out of Calgary, Canada. For those of you who may not be familiar, roller derby is a fast-paced, full-contact sport played on roller skates. It's a beautiful strategic game. But like any hitting sport, such as rugby or ice hockey, sometimes you make the hits, and sometimes, well, the hits make you. As an athlete, I received a series of concussions. I thought I knew how to deal with them sensibly. I took time off sport, followed return to play guidelines set out by my medical team, and life always returned to normal within a week or maybe two, until, of course, the time when it didn't. My last concussion 5 years ago was a life-altering event. In the weeks following the concussion, I was confused, disoriented, unable to read or write, cook a meal, or even walk properly. I had a severe constant headache, and the room wouldn't stop spinning. It was like being very, very drunk all of the time. I had to give up my job and undergo months of rehabilitation. And even now, I continue to cope with the effects that concussion and its recovery process have had on my body and mind. Staring at screens and long Zoom conferences are a struggle for me. Throughout the recovery process, I lacked the language and the comprehension to explain to doctors, friends, and family what I was experiencing and how severe my deficits were. I was frightened, depressed, and in constant agony. Virginia Woolf once wrote, "Let a sufferer try to describe a pain in his head to a doctor, and language at once runs dry." That was me. I struggled to articulate the problems that I was having, the dizziness, memory loss, the inability to hold anything in my left hand. I tried to find anything that would accurately reflect these experiences, but nothing was quite right. Medical descriptions contained long lists of symptoms, but offered no insight on how to live with those symptoms. Memoirs explained how wealthy professional athletes received care, but I was an amateur with a day job. So I started a voice log to capture what I was feeling. This is some notes from the very first few days made with the help of my teammates. Ear ringing, blurred vision, uneven pupils, confusion, slow reaction time, lost deer look, bad coordination, nauseous feeling, headache, especially left temple, tight neck, tight jaw, emotional. I thought maybe doctors would want to see these notes, but they never did. As I became more coherent, I started to compose poetry. On the porch, the snow that isn't here falls beautiful and thick in front of the evergreens. Church bells aren't ringing. There are no churches. I meander like a drunkard, pace the baseball diamond, a klutz waltz, neuromuscular shamble of muscles not firing and vestibular injury. I realize I am replicant, a cyborg malfunction. 1, 2, scuff. Mrs. Palmer, there are things dark and heinous in this world. 1, 2, scuff. 1, 2, scuff. Want to ooze, cough. Ms. Palmer, there are things drac and heinous in this world. Poetry can explore and investigate thoughts without attempting to explain or resolve them. Language is a foundational structure for thought, and poetry can play in that structure, wobble it, dismantle it, reassemble it, copy it, and embody it. Representing fragmented language in this way is more visceral than the clinical description, decreased ability to formulate discourse. As literary theorist Julia Novak explains, poetry, quote, liberates writers automatically from the constraints of coherent narrative. it is easy to see how poetry can be appropriated as a medium for autobiography. Writing about oneself requires activating one's memory, and individual memories of our past do not usually come to us in a coherent linear form, end quote. This is especially true after a brain injury, which brings its own kind of incoherence. Though there is an expectation that healing will be a linear process, it is often not. Literature is perhaps the closest one can get to experiencing concussion without actually going through a physical brain injury. Theory around embodied cognition shows that as a person reads, they create a simulation, an embodied simulation, as part of the process of comprehending text. As theorist Raymond W. Gibbs Jr. writes, embodied simulations enable people to project themselves into the minds and actions of others, which enhances empathy and understanding, end quote. Concussion poetry, then, can enable those who have not been concussed to inhabit a similar cognitive space, to imagine the difficulties that these symptoms create, to perhaps imaginatively project themselves into the situation. They can relive the sensory disturbance of concussion. This has particular significance for those who interact with people who have experienced brain injury. Medical personnel, caregivers, family and friends, even employers can benefit from increased empathy towards the needs of neurodiverse individuals. And of course, stories by people with brain injury directed at others with brain injury can be a powerful act of solidarity. To see yourself reflected in the media you consume situates you as a member of an existing community. It says you are not alone. Most public awareness of concussion comes from media coverage of head injury in sport. One study from 2011, but still relevant, on how concussions are managed in the Australian National Rugby League found that the audience will see the majority of injured players either continue to play or return to play, having displayed symptoms that the public are otherwise told require more caution and more stringent management than demonstrated in each of these incidents. And the source of that study is McKellen and McKinley. Despite concussion awareness campaigns, audiences are constantly exposed to head injuries being managed in ways that ignore guidelines and best practice principles, which would be if there's a suspected concussion, you do not return to the field of play. This is also true of head injury representations in fictional mediums. Think of how often an action hero gets knocked out only to jump back into action with no long-term side effects in the very next scene, or how amnesia works in a soap opera. This undermines medical practitioners who are working to have the general public and sporting communities treat brain injuries as the serious health events they are. Literary and artistic depictions of concussion allow for a counterflow, an increasingly nuanced representation. It develops an alternative to these popular depictions as concussions as a fleeting problem that resolves itself, or just another knock on the head. There are several contemporary poets writing about their own experience with brain injury, including Ian Kinney, Janine Joseph, and Ellie Kralji Gardner. In Trauma Head, Ellie Kralji Gardner blends medical documentation and her personal experience of a mini stroke into poetry that reflects the disruption of self that emerges from such an experience. While stroke and concussion are very different medical events, both share symptoms, and so the poetic strategies of both experiences align. The poetry is at times disorienting and abstract, and at other times very specifically rooted in a single moment of experience. This juxtaposition enables a reflection of how personal experience is formed by the amalgamation of both a sequence of events and the feeling that those events elicit. Trauma Head begins in health, with the narrator exercising at a park. During the workout, the sudden onset of symptoms is described between faltering sit-ups, inserting itself between the exercises with violent slashes. Sit up. If the left eyelid, twitch. Sit up. If the left cheek, contract. Up. If the forehead, prickle. The reader is thrust into the experience, the punctuation dramatizing the moment of this mini stroke, also known as a transient ischemic attack, or TIA. These lines read like stage directions, and bears similarities to the lines and patterns of the medical charts that show up later in the book. This draws attention to the impersonal nature of the symptoms. The body responds to the stroke with a set of actions separate from the will of the person experiencing the stroke. Due to their training, medical personnel can interpret these symptoms as indicative of a TIA, but for the patient, they're a sudden, inexplicable breakdown of bodily function, a faltering of connection between mind and body with no obvious cause. Poetry allows authors then to dig into this affect of experience, something that medical literature by necessity lacks. These head injury poems are often a way of working through a complicated relationship with oneself and one's body, alongside conflicting feelings of being depersonalized within a medical system. Poets investigate identity and selfhood by probing at language. The language that accumulates around brain injury is as multifaceted as brain injury itself, from descriptive medical jargon to the emotional outburst by a patient experiencing heightened lability, from a highly organized chart of symptoms to the fragmented language of aphasia. The combination of disrupted memory, personality, cognition, and emotion, alongside physical deficits that can impact self-image, generates an urge to make sense of what can feel like senseless violence, to assist others who may go through a similar scenario, and to reassert oneself as the author of one's own narrative after a depersonalizing medical experience. There is a me I'll never be again. This happens to everyone with age and time, but a head injury is an abrupt change of narrative arc. I still occasionally grieve the old me, the what could have been, but that's a picture, an image pinned in time. Here I am now, living and thinking in the present moment, and writing poetry to express the relationship between then and now. Ultrasonic. Moths muffled in acoustic armor, fuzz swaddled, I wrap myself in blankets. Every sound a fingernail scraping spine, pressing between each vertebra, all too muchness. The physical pain of pitches, pop songs, pedestrian crossings, sirens, the kettle boiling, my whole face tense, my shoulders squint to my ears, eyes screw tight because sounds hurt worse in light. The soft glow of day through navy blue curtains and overbright screech. Some moths have no ears, cannot hear. Others have tympanal membranes so sensitive they eavesdrop on the ultrasonic conversation of bats. I cocoon and wish to emerge earless. Hush, hush, hush. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Claire. Indeed, if everyone shared their reactions by applause and thumbs up and such, that'd be great. And with that, I'd like to open it for questions for Claire. Just as a reminder, to repeat what Justine said earlier, for those of you who have a question, if you'd press on the participants toggle button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a raise hand option come up when the participant window appears. And with that, I turn it over to FJD5. Unfortunately, that's all I have for you. Can you unmute yourself and ask Claire a question?
Hi, Claire, I'm Francesca.
Hi, Francesca.
Hi, that was amazing. Thank you so much. Wow, you really moved me a number of times. My question is, did you think in poetry before your injury? Did you have experience of poetry?
Yeah, so I actually did before my injury, I did a master's in creative writing and published a book of poetry about the language politics of Papua New Guinea. So it was interesting because I had this life as a poet and a professional freelance writer, and I actually worked for a neurosurgeon as his writer, producing grant applications, articles, manuscripts. And then I had a career change because I was involved in roller derby and had this brief window of being young and fit enough to pursue that to a high level. So I kind of made that my full-time life. And then after my injury, when I wasn't able to be in noisy spaces, it was kind of a return to this former self. So yeah, I had a background of poetry before, and it was an interesting kind of transition back to poetry.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Patrick has the next question.
I do, and I apologize for asking yet another question. I can't, I'm not sure what screen. I might be looking sideways at you because I don't know where the camera's coming from because of the screens. I agree, Claire, that was phenomenal, actually. This is such an interesting space. I'm a psychologist, and I see huge therapeutic value in poetry. I see a huge analytical value in it, particularly poetry from young people with acute mental health problems that aren't related to brain injury specifically. So my question really is I suppose where are you going with it? I detected, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, a sense in which the psychology literature will frame this all in terms of neglect. It will frame this in terms of deficiency because medics are told to fix a problem. But this is about understanding that for psychiatry, for neurorehabilitation, it actually is about engaging the self in that process of recuperation and treatment, if you like. So are you focused on understanding this to feed into therapeutic approaches? And I suppose if you are, a slight note of caution that I good luck, because a lot of medics aren't necessarily ready for that. But yeah, where are you going? What do you hope to get out of this? Is it really about expressing this and articulating concussion and some of the problems associated with brain injury, or is it about an avenue into longer term therapeutics?
So that's a really multifaceted question. So so thank you for that. So there are a few different avenues that I'm pursuing at the moment. So one is the pure relation of experience and the tie into understanding and processing my experience by looking at the medical literature. My PhD is being co-supervised by the departments of English and Anatomy here. So the wonderful Christine Gissoni is keeping me in line neuroscientifically, double checking all my work to make sure that I'm interpreting the neuroscience correctly. But I am also involved in an upcoming anthology called Women Writing Through Concussion that is being produced by the University of Alberta Press. And that book has actually been produced in conjunction with St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto, and has been used to, it's being used as a method of study for the concussion research team there to catch areas that have been missed in the medical treatment experienced by these various authors. So they're looking for similarities of experience in order to better engage with their own practice in the concussion center at St. Mike's Hospital. Unfortunately, that's on pause due to COVID restrictions while all medical resources are being redirected. But hopefully it picks up again in the future. And then another thing that I'm doing is engaging as a presenter with medical practitioners and at science conferences, so that I am taking this personal poetry and this kind of experiential first-person experience to the people who I think could benefit from hearing something a little more personal than the case studies that they read in school. So those are some of the different ways that I'm engaging with the medical community, but also the broader public through my work.
Great, let's thank our speaker again. So we have to move on to our next speaker now. Thanks again, Claire.